Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The president is dead. Well, not quite yet, but not for the want of trying. Long live the president. It's becoming quite a habit, first in the Ukraine and now in Egypt. President Mohammed Morsi barely got a year with which to apply his democratic mandate before a military coup, hiding behind genuine popular grievances, overthrew him. Although General Sisi will now be called the president, he'll always be the general to me and to most Egyptians who boycotted his neither free nor fair election in which he won, I suppose we could put that in quotes, over 90% of the vote.
Election or no election, General Sisi had already been ruling the country as the head of a military junta for nearly a year, whilst Morsi's year of living dangerously in Cairo's presidential palace was hardly a great economic or political success. He surely doesn't deserve to be behind bars, accused of being the head of a terrorist organization and of such unusual crimes for an Arab president of collaborating with the Palestinian resistance.
And what message does it send to Islamist organizations? That they can fight democratic elections, they can even win them, but they will never be permitted to rule, at least through the ballot box. Joining us now to discuss the crisis in Egypt is one of the Muslim world's most important and most eloquent analysts. He's the head of the Cordoba Foundation, Dr. Anas Altakriti. Dr. Anas, thanks for joining us. It's farcical, isn't it? Over 90% of the vote. But the most telling circumstance is surely the huge numbers of people who didn't vote at all.
Well, George, thank you very much for having me on. And you're absolutely right. The questions that you ask are absolutely spot on. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we're back to the bad old days. We're back to the 90% plus free and fair votes. But as you rightly put it, the actual story that is even being reported by the official media outlets and broadcasters is the fact that no one turned up. To the extent that the Reuters correspondent yesterday was reporting from three main election posts, and throughout the 3.5 hours that they were reporting, tweeting throughout, only one person turned out. And this, by the way, was after the government had extended the elections for a third day.
Yeah. They said because it had been too hot.
It'd been too hot, and people were sort of busy celebrating the atmosphere of the elections, and therefore they were a little bit taken aback and weren't ready to go out and actually vote. So it's nothing less than farcical. But then again, since the military coup, unfortunately, we're back to how the vast majority of the Arab world is. We're back to the status quo. We're back to how certain regimes, particularly in the Gulf, would love for things to be in Egypt and beyond.
And the actual president is in prison, facing what, by any stretch of the imagination, are capital charges. In other words, he might be executed. Whilst the dictator that the revolution overthrew is outside of jail. And whilst the general says he's the heir of President Nasser, he is in fact the heir of President Mubarak, no?
True. In fact, if anything, then even the official commentators are all saying quite clearly that we are now back to times that are even worse in terms of human rights, in terms of freedoms, in terms of the economy, everything, back to even worse than how they were in early 2011 before Mubarak was ousted by the Egyptian revolution. So it's a funny state of affairs. And to be absolutely honest, whilst looking at the Arab world over the past century, you'd see, well, this is sort of par for course. But what is strange is how the so-called democratic world, the West, is reacting to all this. Because whilst we have seen in front of our eyes, in front of, hundreds of millions, billions in fact, watching their screens as a military coup actually unfolded minute by minute. The West then, and particularly our government here in the UK, chooses to actually look into and investigate the victims, the Muslim Brotherhood, whilst the world watches and does absolutely nothing. To be honest, it's that really is totally baffling.
Speaking of human rights, the 700 people for death penalty, that must be a joke, yeah? They are not really going to be death sentenced.
Well, I'll tell you what. I mean, the numbers are hilarious, if not tragic, on their own account. But if you actually knew the details of how this was passed, it would become really, beyond funny. A court hearing that was for less than 90 minutes, precisely 86 minutes, in which the judge managed to look through the case of 527 on one occasion, then 638 on a second occasion, cases, out of whom less than 15 people ever saw the inside of that court. Most of whom, and by the way, amongst those sentenced to death, were people who had already died. One of them, by the way, was a Palestinian who had been martyred by an Israeli missile more than 7 years ago. Huh? He was declared a terrorist who had perpetrated certain crimes. The other thing is that all these people were condemned to death and condemned to hang because all of them had killed one policeman. We're talking about, unfortunately, a part of the world which nothing is independent. The judiciary is totally politicized. The political is totally securitized. And everything is absolutely corrupt. And therefore...
the media, of course, now
and the media is
completely hegemonic.
100%.
Junta property.
As soon as, within 1 hour... I mean, we can talk about the shortcomings and the failures of Morsi all we want.
We will.
However, within the 11 months that he was in rule, not one single person was arrested for their views and their opinions. Not one single media station was closed down or oppressed because they were criticizing the president, and they were throughout those 11 months.
Ruthlessly, yeah.
Within an hour of him being ousted, 17 media stations were closed down. More than 312 journalists and media spokespeople were arrested, and within a matter of 3 months, we had more than 19,000 political prisoners. It just tells you what kind of situation we're in.
Indeed, it speaks volumes. But we can't elide the shortcomings of Morsi's administration. It is a bit of a world record. All of this is world record territory, but it's a bit of a world record to have won an election and have so many people dislike you. Nothing like the absurd figures that are claimed, of course, but clearly millions dislike you so much that they're on the streets and creating the cover for a military junta to overthrow you?
I think that there are a number of things to be said. First of all, the Arab Spring, at the very height of it, in early 2011, with the way in which the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia fell, and then the Hosni Mubarak regime fell, that brought with it an incredible amount of hope and aspiration. And maybe, Morsi and maybe, the Nahda in Tunisia, maybe they were sort of victims to that kind of high level of aspiration and hopes. People thought that, and they had the right to hope that, within a matter of days, weeks, maybe even a couple of months, things would be sorted out. So when it took a year or 2 years even, and the problems were still mounting and people were still finding it difficult on a daily level, of course, people got quite anxious. But you can't really put aside the fact that a country that had been riddled with corruption, political, military, economic, on every single level, for decades, you really, realistically can't expect things to change within a matter of 11 months. With all, the kind of attempts, some true, some maybe for populist reasons, to reach out, to engage. We had the very first Copt vice president in the history of Egypt. We had the very first vice president female in the history of Egypt. We had the very first time that a president who had the chance of appointing 52 members to the Consultative Council from his own party elected only to choose 6, whilst all the others from all other parties. But that was never good enough for the ideologues. And you have to realize, George, that all these changes happened in Egypt and Tunisia. All these things happen in a region where democracy, freedom, the true will of people is to be forbidden, is never to be spoken of. I mean, when you have someone like Saudi Arabia, where the changes in Egypt would totally undermine it, totally see that its own rule, its own existence is, totally without any kind of justification, without any kind of credibility. It won't stay quiet whilst this goes on and people have their
They spent
voice.
billions to try and bring down President Morsi, no doubt. Now, General Sisi, as I alluded earlier, claims that he's the new Nasser, or some of his supporters do. But Nasser's rule was characterized by three things. First of all, total support for the Palestinian people and opposition to Israel. General Sisi couldn't be closer to Israel and is putting on trial President Morsi for collaborating with the Palestinian resistance. Number two, President Nasser tried to bring down the reactionary feudal monarchies in the Gulf. General Sisi has received billions of dollars from these very same reactionary feudal monarchies. And of course, President Nasser's orientation was towards Moscow, and General Sisi's is certainly towards the United States, which, despite a few words from President Obama in the immediate aftermath of the coup, continues to arm and finance the military junta. So where do we go from here?
Well, I think there are a number of things that need to happen. First of all, inside Egypt, the popular uprising is still ongoing. Every single day there are protests in their dozens, if not hundreds. On some occasions, and particularly in populated areas, we are seeing thousands hit the street, despite the fact that every single one of those people who hit the streets will be threatened in terms of their jobs, their welfare, their security, and probably their lives. So we're still seeing that. And that, to be honest, is on the increase, not on the fall, as many, including myself, expected a few months ago. The other thing that regionally, we really have to see this idea, this concept of the Arab Spring through. And to be honest, we need to see more change happening on the streets of areas that haven't directly been touched by the Arab Spring, including Gulf states, including really, we need to see some real change take place, because it's been proven now through Egypt and largely through Tunisia that any kind of change, whether it be elections or democratic revolutions or whatever, those with money will see to it that those are undermined and scuppered. So we need change regionally. And I think that there are signs that such changes is taking place. The third is we really need to work here in the West, in the UK, across the world, in terms of really shaming these governments. I mean, the way what you say is true about Obama making certain protestations just out of embarrassment, because it's been such an embarrassment in Egypt, the way that this whole thing has happened. But actually, the support has been full. And to be honest, the only thing that I put to people is that the fact that Netanyahu and, lo and behold, Tony Blair supported Sisi, I think, tells us just about enough.
Just about. Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Dr. Anas. Coming up after the break, we're looking at China, fast becoming economically the most powerful country in the world, and thus inevitably increasingly pilloried by the Western political class and their media echo chamber, whose hegemony China threatens. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sputnik. Jude Woodward knows more about China than almost anybody else in this country. She frequently lectures there and is the author of a forthcoming and much anticipated book on the subject. Formerly, she was a very senior official in Mayor Ken Livingstone's London administration, and I'm glad to say she joins us now.
Hi there.
Jude, I was in a session at the Hay on Wye festival last weekend, where a collection of so-called China experts, some of whom have done rather well out of China, not only didn't have very many good things to say about China, but were very clearly getting into battle mode. All sorts of issues were raised, but one of the China experts rather boldly predicted that China was going to collapse. Is it?
Well, there is a whole industry in saying China's economy is about to collapse. The Economist famously ran a front-page dragon about to run out of puff in 2002. So This has been the prediction year on year. You have a ridiculous sort of approach that China's economy is slowing, which indeed it has somewhat from its fastest rates of growth, but last year it grew at 7.7%, I think. They're anticipating 7.5 to 7.7% this year. That is slower than 8 or 9 or indeed 10%, but the last quarter's growth in the United States was 0.1%. So who is slowing? Who has got a problem?
Who's running out of puff? Yes. But it's predicted, or it's predicated, I should say, these predictions, on a belief that that nothing can be that successful for such a long time. China has lifted more people out of poverty than any country, any regime in all human history in the past 30 years. I suppose it's on the principle that what goes up must come down. Must it come down in China?
No, definitely not. There's no it will slow slightly. The population is aging. That will reduce growth by 1 or 2% a year. But as long as it doesn't make stupid errors, the structure of its economy is more effective than the structure of the West. Primarily, the role of a very large state sector, particularly state control over the banks and financial systems, so that coming out of the financial crisis in 2008, China was in a position to direct its banks to invest in order to re-stimulate the economy and get it out of crisis, which the West pleaded with the banks to do this, but had no control to make them do it. Very high levels of investment in the economy, high levels of savings. So unless China makes some suicidal mistake and embarks on a vast program of privatization of crucial sectors of the economy, or gives in to Western pressure for a very large revaluation of the RMB, or the various things that the West demands, there's no reason why it can't maintain a slower but considerably faster level of growth than anything seen in the West. Of course, China's not alone. Vietnam has also been growing rather strongly based on a similar economic structure, but also if you look at the period of most success of Japan, for example, it had very high investment levels, which then came down, and it hit big financial crisis plus a big revaluation of the yen. So as long as China doesn't do any of these stupid things, which I believe are a product of capitalist free market economies, then...
You probably won't be surprised then that both of these demands were being made at the Hay-on-Wye Festival by representatives of the very biggest banks and other businesses doing well in their trade and investment with and in China. Instead, China has made this turn, hasn't it, recently announced, to more, if you like, direction of capital to building up itself, to building up demand within China. Less export-driven and more domestically oriented.
Well, it needs to do that because world trade is so stagnant since the economic crisis. So there was virtually no growth in China's external trade in the first quarter of the year. But this is not really a problem of China. This is a problem of the world economy. There's no emergence from the great stagnation at the level of the Western economies. And so unless the Western economies start to pick up and trade starts to pick up, there's no one to export to.
Isn't that also partly due to the fact that many plants that used to be in China, established with cheap labor, has all moved to Vietnam, amongst others?
Well, China is moving up the value chain. What that means is that wage levels in China are rising. Therefore, it's not the location of choice for the most low-level basic type of manufacturing. But at the same time, China is moving up the value chain and increasingly attracting other types of business which requires higher levels of technological, IT and other skills, and also developing its own technology companies.
Of course, it's not just the economy coming under fire, the demand that China should be more capitalist if it's going to continue to grow and thrive. But just in case, some foreign policy issues and also some internal ones are being dragged onto the battlefield. Let's deal with the internal one first. In the Xinjiang province, where 40 to 45% of the people are Uyghur Muslims, there is a terrorist problem, suicide bombings, mass killings actually by these separatists, and of course a Chinese government crackdown on them. Suddenly we're beginning to hear Western commentators discover a long-lost sympathy for the plight of the Uyghurs. China on the right lines in how it's handling this question?
There was an article in the New York Times today or yesterday saying that the mess that's been made of the situation in the Middle East is that Al-Qaeda forces are spreading all over the place. American intervention doesn't defeat Al-Qaeda, it just
displaces it
and encourages it.
Spreads it, yeah.
And you have, and some, that obviously China is extremely worried, as the Central Asian republics are very worried, of some spillover of this type of development into Xinjiang. It's taken a policy of, its policy from 2011, I think, or 2010, was to direct very big levels of investment towards Xinjiang to try and grow the province out of the problems. But to some extent, that's created more problems because there's been a lot of inflow of population because there's growth in business factories, mineral extraction, etc. And not all of those jobs have gone to the local people. So there are some economic grievances which China is trying to address and putting a lot of effort into, but at the same time there's been an upsurge of, you know, quite horrible knife attacks on people in mainland China,
crimes are real
etc. So there's a sort of stepped up security at the same time.
Just briefly, Alas, China's border or territorial disputes with Japan over islands seems now to be being replicated in a conflict with Vietnam, which is particularly sad for people of our generation. What's the basis of that clash with Vietnam?
Well, remember there's bad blood and has been bad blood between China and Vietnam for a long time, which is a very sad thing, and it is a product of what was an even sadder thing, which was the whole Sino-Soviet conflict in the Cold War period, where China became after falling out with Russia, became very fearful of being encircled by pro-Soviet regimes. The dispute with Vietnam is of long duration. It looked like it was getting into a good place. Li Keqiang visited Hanoi 6 months ago. Things have calmed down enormously over the last couple of years. But then China decided to start drilling for oil. Now, on China's side on this, everyone else is already drilling for oil. The only country that wasn't drilling for oil in the disputed areas was China. But unfortunately, either a misjudgment or a deliberate step, by drilling where they chose to drill, it was a straight flare-up with Vietnam.
Well, let's hope they can iron things out. Jude Woodward, I told you she was an expert. Thank you very much indeed. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, about the Egyptian elections, we asked, well, first it was Ukraine and now Egypt. How does the West get away with this? Eddie Bernard answers, EU countries can't think beyond the Yankee dollar and are US lapdogs. They choose US policy before their own. And Greg Burgoyne says, too much, too often. They call it self-determination, a unique brand of US foreign policy.
Indeed, indeed it is, yes. But the media silence is more striking. I keep saying this.
Yeah.
I know why the political leaders prefer General Sisi in charge, because, well, they pay him and he'll do what they want them to. What I fail to understand is how all these journalists, hundreds of them, in all countries, are able to completely suspend judgment that they would normally be quick to make in other circumstances, so that, you know, a coup in Ukraine, a coup in Egypt becomes something that they welcome rather than condemn.
Well, that's why you're aptly described as the media echo chamber.
Yeah.
On China, we asked when they will put up their political weight in the world, to which we received quite a lot of hostile response on their domestic issues regarding human rights in some areas, and of course it not being a democracy officially. So, will this be a Chinese century? To which Neil Barrington answers, I think so. Went to a debate on that very subject, and without the huge sacrifices of the Mao era, would have never been possible.
Well, let's hope it's a multipolar century. That's what I'm hoping for.
Indeed. And that's all we have time for.
Which sadly means that's the end of the show.
Please do keep in touch with us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik, and please like us on Facebook at Sputnik on Russia Today. Goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.